So as you probably have noticed already, I have less hair than our last video. And that is because, yes, I'm going bald. So I've decided to be proactive. Rather than having the funky comb over or hanging on for so long past the time when it looks respectable, I've just decided we're going short. And eventually we'll probably buzz it all the way, but I wanted to ease into it. Now, baldness is something that men really struggle with. Some men, it is crippling, debilitating, humiliating. Other men embrace it and they pull it off. They look good. I don't know which way I'm going to lean on that spectrum, but for right now, it's a lot easier and I'm saving a lot of money on shampoo. But baldness is actually what I want to talk about today. Go ahead if you haven't already and hit the subscribe button. And if you like this video after you're done watching it, click the like button. And if you really like it, share it with other people. Let's talk about some baldness in the Bible and boys getting mauled by bears, shall we? If you spent any time on wiki skeptic message boards or have talked to people who love pointing out the evil or dark passages in the Bible and how the God of the Bible is arbitrary and vindictive and insufferable, then you may have heard about this story in 2 Kings chapter 2. That's what we're going to look at today because it's a pretty odd story. If you're reading in the King James, as many critics like to quote from because it's free and public domain, you'll read, "And he went up from thence unto Bethel. And as he was going up by the way, there came forth little children out of the city, and mocked him, and said unto him, Go up, thou bald head, go up, thou bald head. And he turned back and looked on them, and cursed them in the name of the Lord. And there came forth 2 she-bears out of the wood, and tare 42 children of them. And he went from thence to Mount Carmel, and from thence he returned to Samaria." Now, if you read this in a modern translation, like the NIV, it says, "From there Elisha went up to Bethel. As he was walking along the road, some boys came out of town and jeered at him. 'Get out of here, Baldy,' they said. 'Get out of here, Baldy.' Then he turned around, looked at them, and called down a curse on them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the boys." That is not your average Sunday school story. How many of you even knew this story was in the Bible? A lot of people don't get back into the Old Testament books, certainly not the books of Kings, but it's right there. And this Bible verse has been a source of embarrassment to people for centuries, probably longer, millennia. Why would God send bears to eat 42 children innocently laughing at an old bald man? That doesn't make any sense. Is that the kind of God we serve? Is this the God of the Bible? But before we start critiquing or theologizing, a good rule of thumb is to always make sure that we actually understand what the original author of the original text actually wrote and how it would have been received by the original audience. Only then can we jump in and say, what does this mean to us today? This text is a great example of why, when studying the Bible, you should never rely on just one English translation. Even the best translations aren't able to fully capture things in the original language in a way that always makes sense in modern language, especially in the modern English language, which is always changing. So translators always have to make choices in how they present the text to us, and then rely on teachers who understand the text, who will then help guide people as they're seeking to interpret the text, which is what we here at Disciple Dojo strive to do. So let's look at the actual text in the Hebrew Bible. I have put the words that are in question in different colors, and then down here in their English translations, I've given you the range of meanings. So what this in a woodenly literal sense says is, "And he went up from there," Bethel, "and he going up on the road," and here we come to these first 2 terms that are going to be important. Young, small, or insignificant, that's this word, katanim. Youths, young men, boys, and that's this word, no'arim. So no'arim katanin can mean young men, it can mean young boys, it can mean small boys, it can mean insignificant men, it can mean insignificant youths, it can mean small youths. Whoever these were came out from the city. And I put in purple because there's a little bit of a wordplay here we'll talk about later. And they, now we come to our second word, and they mocked or derided against, upon, or at him. So they did something to him, but we don't know exactly what just yet. And they said to him, and then we come to this phrase, ele karea. Ele karea can either mean ascend, or it can just mean go up or go on. And then kareak means baldy. So ascend or go up, baldy. Ascend or go up, baldy. And he turned after or behind him, or he turned around, and he saw, or he looked at them. You could translate either way. And then we come to this word, and he pronounced a curse against them. This verb in Hebrew, kalal, in the name of Yahweh. And 2 bears came from the thicket and tore up from them 42 of the, and then this last word, yeladim, which can be translated as youths, boys, or young men. So this is what we have going on. That's a disturbing story, no matter how you look at it. People getting mauled by bears, I mean, if you watched Grizzly Man, you know that's pretty rough way to go. However, it's important if we're going to critique the Bible, if we're going to criticize the Bible, to critique it and criticize it correctly. And in this case, I'm going to make the argument that God did not send 2 she-bears to maul 42 Nelsons. This wasn't a case of a crotchety old bald man. What are you kids laughing at? Get 'em, bears! Nothing like that happened. You like my old man voice? In fact, the prophet wasn't even an old man. This is at the beginning of Elisha's ministry. Elisha's in his 20s, maybe 25 at this point. So if he's bald, he's prematurely bald, but he's not an old grumpy man. So first of all, get that impression out of your mind. Secondly, these are not just a group of laughing, jolly, innocent toddlers running out and laughing at somebody like little kids are prone to do. If you've ever been around little kids, and I work with little kids, they can be pretty mean sometimes. But I'm going to suggest, and I'm going to try to demonstrate, that's not what's going on here. Take a look at this first term that's used, these na'arim katanim. What are these small boys, small children, small youths, young men? Which is it? Well, let's take a look at where these terms are used elsewhere in Scripture. That's always a good rule of thumb. If you come across a word that you don't know exactly how it should be treated, then see how it's used elsewhere in the Bible. So this word in Hebrew is na'ar, the first one, and in the Septuagint, in the Greek, it's paidarion. And often it has the meaning of young man, like really often. Take a look. In Genesis 14:24, when Abraham gets back from a successful battle, he says, I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten and the share that belongs to the men who went with me. Now, these men are his fighting men, his Hebrew samurai, as we say in the podcast where we teach on this passage. The Na'ar, these youth, in this case, are warriors. Same thing with the men of Sodom. Genesis 19, verse 4, before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. So young can also mean men, as in the case of the men of Sodom. These are the ones who surrounded the house in order to abuse the angelic visitors. It's also used to describe Isaac when Abraham was going to sacrifice his son. Now, a lot of times people have just assumed Isaac was a little boy when Abraham was told to offer him up, but that's not the case. Isaac was somewhere between 20 and 37 years old at the time. And so rabbinic tradition has Isaac being 37 years old. The phrase that's translated, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Then Abraham returned to his servants. That's the same word. Boy translated here is servants translated here. And this is describing the boy is Isaac, who is actually a man when this is happening. When Shechem seduces and then wants to marry Dinah, it says the young man who was the most honored of all his father's family lost no time in doing what they said because he was delighted with Jacob's daughter. Shechem was a Na'ar. He was a young man when he wanted to marry Dinah after their illicit affair. In Genesis 37, this is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17. And then in Genesis 41, this is the prisoners telling Pharaoh about Joseph. They say, a young Hebrew was there with us. And it uses the word, again, young, Na'ar. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. So Joseph, during all of his years in Pharaoh's dungeon, was a Na'ar, a young man. In Exodus 33, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. Then Moses would return to the camp, but his young aide, Joshua, son of Nun, did not leave the tent. So Joshua was a young man, a Na'ar. Same thing with the spies of Jericho. So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab. Young men. They weren't little boys. Boaz asked the young man. That's what it actually, this word overseer is young man who oversees the harvesters. Verse 2:9, he says, watch the field where the men are harvesting. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. Drink from the jars of water the men have filled. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. Stay with my workers. All ways of translating this word. Men, workers, young men. When we first meet David, in fact, he's described using both of these terms, both na'ar, which is young man, and katon, which means small, insignificant, or younger. In 1 Samuel 16:11, he asked Jesse, are these all the sons you have? And he actually asked him, are these all the na'ar you have? There is still the katon, the smallest or youngest, Jesse answered. He's tending the sheep. And so Samuel said, send for him. Well, he's talking about David. Then in the next chapter, when David's fighting Goliath, he's getting ready. Saul says, you're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a na'ar, a young man. And he has been a warrior from his youth, his young manness, his na'arness. See, in the historical books, this term na'ar, it can refer to what we would today call a little boy, but a lot of the times it doesn't. It refers to people that we would consider young warriors. 1 Samuel 21:2, David answered Ahimelech the priest, the king sent me on a mission and said to me, no one is to know anything about the mission I'm sending you on. As for my men, Chapter 21, the priest answered David, I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women. And David replied, indeed, women have been kept from us as usual whenever I set out. The men's bodies are holy, even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today? Chapter 25, so he sent 10 young men and said to them, go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. When David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name. Verse 12, David's men turned around and went back. Verse 25, this is Abigail speaking. Please pay no attention, my lord, to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. As for me, your servant, I did not see the men my lord sent. Verse 27, let this gift which your servant has brought to my lord be given to the men who follow you. And it's not just David's men, but soldiers in general are often referred to by this term, na'ar. 1 Samuel 30, David fought them from dusk until the evening of the next day, and none of them got away except 400 young men who rode off on camels and fled. 2 Samuel 2, then Abner said to Joab, let's have some of the young men get up and fight hand to hand in front of us. Then Abner said to him, turn aside to the right or left, take on one of the young men and strip him of his weapons. 2 Samuel 13, Absalom ordered his men, and then so Absalom's men did to Amnon what Absalom had ordered. Chapter 18, and 10 of Joab's armor bearers. This time it's translated as armor bearers because your na'ar would frequently be your armor bearer, like in 1 Kings 20. But who will do this? Asked Ahab. The prophet replied, this is what the Lord says. The junior officers, there's the word, na'ar, under the provincial commanders will do it. And who will start the battle, he asked. The prophet answered, you will. So Ahab summoned the 232 junior na'ar officers under the provincial commanders. Then he assembled the rest of the Israelites, 7,000 in all. Or 1 Chronicles, chapter 12, and Zadok, a brave young warrior, with 22 officers from his family. Or the Israelites in Nehemiah's day. From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. Even kings could be referred to as na'ar sometimes, or would-be kings in the case of Absalom. 2 Samuel 18, the king commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake. Absalom's an adult who's trying to seize the throne of his father through violent means and subterfuge. This is Game of Thrones type stuff. So this is not a little boy, yet David consistently refers to Absalom using this term of young man. 1812, protect the young man Absalom for my sake. 1829, is the young man Absalom safe? 1832, is the young man Absalom safe? And the Cushite replied, may the enemies of my lord and the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man. In fact, when praying to God, King Solomon actually used both katan and na'ar in his prayer to God. Look what he says. Now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. He wasn't a little child. He was the king of Israel. And then when the country split in two after his death, Jeroboam is described this way. In 1128, we read, now Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of the tribes of Joseph. Or how about the prophet Jeremiah? Jeremiah begins his book, alas, sovereign Lord, I do not know how to speak. I am too young. He uses that phrase, a na'ar, a young man. And it's also a term used to describe the personal attendants in a king's royal court. So for instance, King Xerxes, remember him from 300? Well, he was married to Esther. And in Esther, chapter 2, it says, then the king's personal attendants, that's the word, not are. It's translated as personal attendants here, proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. And then in chapter 6, what honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. And then in verse 5, his attendants answered, Haman is standing in the court, bring him in, the king ordered. Well, what about the term at the end of the story? I mean, at the end of the story, it says that the bears came out and mauled 42 of the, and then it doesn't use na'ar. It uses the word yeled, which means little boy, right? Not always. The Hebrew word yeled, and the Septuagint uses paidion to translate it. It means young man or son or boy. It can have a range of meanings. Here are some of the contexts where it's used. The guy that Lamech fights and kills in Genesis chapter 4. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, listen to me. Wives of Lamech, hear my words. I've killed a man for wounding me, a yeled, young man for injuring me. Or again in the Joseph saga. Remember, Joseph has already been described as a na'ar, but the text also describes him as a yeled. Chapter 37:30. He went back to his brothers and said, the boy isn't there. Where can I turn now? Chapter 42, Reuben replied, didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood. They're talking about Joseph. They're talking to Joseph and don't even realize it because why? Because he's not a little boy. He's the official in Pharaoh's court standing there in front of them who they don't even recognize. He's a man. Or after Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam, who's going to take over the throne of Israel. Well, he's surrounded by these cronies, these advisors, this entourage of his boys that he grew up with. And so when he faces his first crisis as king, he makes a decision and he doesn't listen to the older men, but instead he listens to these young bucks and they give him terrible advice, which ends up destroying the kingdom. But look how they're described. But Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. And then the parallel account in 2 Chronicles, chapter 10, Rehoboam rejected the advice that the elders gave him and consulted the young men. It's also the term used in the book of Ruth to describe Naomi's adult sons who were married to Ruth and Orpah. Ruth chapter 1, verse 5, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. And we also read about some Yeledim, some boys. You may know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In the first chapter of Daniel, there's a search for young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, qualified to serve in the king's palace. The official told Daniel, I'm afraid my lord the king who has assigned your food and drink, why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? Na'ar and yeled, both of these terms have a wide range of meaning. And both of these terms are often, frequently used to describe what we would call teenagers, 20-somethings. I mean, anywhere from 13, 14, all the way up to 30-something. This is actually one of the decisions that the NIV 2011 made that I don't agree with. I think the NIV 1984 had the better reading that preserves the ambiguity in this passage. The 2011 reads, as they were walking along the road, some boys, but the NIV 1984 reads, some youths. So just like in so many other places in the historical books, particularly the books like Kings and Samuel and Chronicles, these young men, these insignificant youths, are actually men of fighting age, most likely. I mean, at the earliest, they would be what we'd call early teenagers, which in the ancient world were old enough to marry and take on the law and be considered adults. They're not the town elders. They're not seasoned men, but they're certainly not toddlers or even adolescents. These are the Na'arim. These are the young men of the town. See, in popular recountings of this story, this is what we picture. What's probably closer to what's actually happening would be something like this or this. These aren't just little boys out laughing and having a good time. This is a crowd of young mocking men. And we know that there's not just 1 or 2 of them because when the bears do the attacking, 42 of them are attacked. And we don't know if that means the bears actually mauled, tore apart, killed 42, or if the bears just attacked the crowd and 42 of them got injured in the process. We don't know. But 42 is a big number. That's a significant number of young men, youths, coming out of a town that already has a history, which we'll get into in a future video, to confront a brand new young prophet, most likely around their same age, and to mock him after the events that have just happened in this story. But what did these young men actually do? Did they just laugh at him like, haha, you're bald? Or did they do something else? The text says that they mocked him, and it uses this word, kalas. The Septuagint uses katapaizo. It means to mock or deride or scorn. It doesn't just mean to laugh at. In Ezekiel 16, it says, when you built your mounds at every street corner and made your lofty shrines in every public square, you were like a prostitute because you scorned payment. Scorned payment. What does that mean? Well, the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament gives us an idea. Kalas, the root denotes the scornful belittling issuing from an attitude which counts as valueless that which is of real value. The primary meaning of this word is seen in Ezekiel 16:31, where Jerusalem is compared to a whore or temple prostitute who gives herself freely, despising, scorning the money. In other words, she counts the money as of no value. So it doesn't just mean to have a chuckle over somebody's bald head. That's not what's going on here. By using this term, these young men of the city, of this known idolatrous city, come out and they are scorning, they are mocking, they are considering Elisha as being of no value. Again, crucially important to recognize the setting in which this story happens. This is right after Elijah, his mentor, has been taken up to heaven across the Jordan. He has crossed back in. He has healed or restored the waters of the city at Jericho. And now he's going up on his way to Bethel, which is the known center of northern Israelite idolatry. And these young men come out of the city jeering him after all of this has just happened, mocking him. This is how these words are used elsewhere. In Ezekiel 22, God says, therefore I will make you an object of scorn to the nations and a laughingstock to all the countries. In other words, Jerusalem will be ruined, and so they will be a mockery. They will be a laughingstock. They will be nothing but scorn and derision in the eyes of all of the nations. Or look down in the Psalms. Psalm 44, you have made us a reproach to our neighbors, the scorn and derision of those around us. Or Psalm 79, we are objects of contempt to our neighbors, of scorn and derision to those around us. So kalas doesn't mean just have a laugh at or joke around with. There's no sense of joking in this verb. This is a sense of scorn, derision, mockery. And these young men of the city are heaping this upon the newly appointed, freshly minted, right out of miracle working young prophet. These young men should have known better. Did God send bears to maul little kids for laughing at an old man's bald head? No. What actually happened, he went up from there, Bethel, and he was going up on the road, and young men came out from the city, and they mocked or derided him. And they said to him, go up, Baldy, go up. And he turned behind him, and he saw and looked at them, and he pronounced a curse against them in the name of Yahweh. He didn't even call the bears. He just pronounced a curse upon those who had just mocked, scorned, cursed him. The young men of this city should have known very well the foundational promise, those who curse you, I will curse, to God's prophets, and they should have known better, but they didn't. They're from an idolatrous city and an idolatrous nation at the height of its idolatry. And so when they encounter a true prophet of God, unlike the people of Jericho, who Elisha just left, they don't meet him with acceptance. They meet him with scorn and with mockery and with ridicule. These are the people of Bethel. Bethel was the place where God appeared to their ancestor Jacob. Bethel means house of God. Bethel was a religious center in Israel during the patriarchal and even the period under Joshua. The young men of Bethel should absolutely have known, don't mock anyone, but especially not a prophet of God. This flies in the face of every notion of ancient Near East hospitality, even modern Middle Eastern hospitality. This is not schoolyard taunting. This is utter rejection of someone, not even on religious grounds, but just on the grounds of normal rules of hospitality in an honor and shame culture. And this was at a key moment in Israel's history. The northern kingdom was teetering on destruction because of their ongoing rebellion and their ongoing apostasy. And now they're encountering an actual, genuine prophet of God, the successor to Elijah. And this is their response. And so, in a very Lex Talionis type way, just as the young men came out from the city, Min Ha'ir, so two bears come out from the thicket, Min Haya'ar. These young men come out to confront God's prophet, Min Ha'ir. God's judgment comes upon them viciously, Min Haya'ar. And this story is a microcosm of what the prophet Hosea was speaking to Israel during this general time frame. Bethel is the religious, idolatrous center of the northern kingdom of Israel. The prophet Hosea is preaching and teaching about the idolatry that has its epicenter at places like Bethel. If you want to interpret 2 Kings chapter 2, fuller in a more theological sense, read it in conjunction with Hosea chapter 13. To the northern kingdom of Israel, which is sometimes referred to as Ephraim. When Ephraim spoke, people trembled. He was exalted in Israel, but he became guilty of Baal worship and died. This is the northern kingdom that Hosea is predicting the destruction of, showing that it is the judgment that they are receiving because of breaking the covenant God made with them at Mount Sinai. We'll talk about this in a future video, I promise. But if you followed along the Disciple Dojo podcast, you should be very familiar with the Sinai covenant and the covenant curses that come from breaking the covenant, which the people of Ephraim, the people of Israel, have been doing brazenly for generations at this point. Now they sin more and more. They make idols for themselves from their silver, cleverly fashioned images, all of them the work of craftsmen. It's said of these people, they offer human sacrifices. They kiss calf idols. Therefore, they will be like the morning mist, like the early dew that disappears, like chaff swirling from a threshing floor, like smoke escaping through a window. They're going to blow away like smoke or like chaff. Why? Because they were doing things like human sacrifice, bowing down and worshiping golden calf idols. Jeroboam installed a golden calf idol at Bethel. It was the heart of idolatry in the northern kingdom. And so the young men that come out of the city to confront the prophet are the fruit of that idolatry that's been going on for generations. And it's reaching its breaking point. And the sign of Elisha and his encounter with those young men should have been a wake-up call to that entire region. But instead it wasn't heeded. And Hosea gives us the commentary. But I've been the Lord your God ever since you came out of Egypt. You shall acknowledge no God but me, no Savior except me. I cared for you in the wilderness, in the land of burning heat. When I fed them, they were satisfied. When they were satisfied, they became proud and they forgot me. Here's the key. So I will be like a lion to them. Like a leopard, I will lurk by the path. Like a bear robbed of her cubs, I will attack them and rip them open. Like a lion, I will devour them. A wild animal will tear them apart. You are destroyed, Israel, because you are against me, against your helper. Now, for what helper means, go ahead and click on this video right here and listen to our very own Professor Diana at Superhero Seminary explain that. But this incident is not teaching that little boys who laugh at old bald men deserve to get mauled by bears. That's a gross caricature of this passage. You have to completely remove it, not only from its literary context. Well, first you have to translate it in a particular way, in the worst way imaginable. Then you have to remove it from its literary context. Then you have to remove it from its theological covenant context. But it was never meant to be treated that way in the first place. This passage exists in a setting, and it has a reason for using the phraseology that it uses. So is this a disturbing story? Yeah. Absolutely, it's a disturbing story. The Bible has a lot of disturbing stories. We don't need to sanitize it. The Bible's not a PG-rated book. There's a lot of R-rated stuff in here. This is a critical prophetic judgment against a people at a time of extreme significance. And so by our standards, if we're just talking about everyday normal life, yeah, this seems really extreme. But so does the Holy Spirit dropping someone dead for fudging the numbers on how much they gave in the offering plate. But that's what God did to Ananias and Sapphira. Or striking someone down because they accidentally touched the ark to keep it from toppling over. But that's what Uzzah found out when he transgressed the bounds of God's holiness at a key moment in Israel's history. See, sometimes God acts in specific ways that we find disturbing, but there is theological significance to why he's acting that way. And ultimately, we have to do what Abraham did all the way back at the beginning when he was told what God was going to do in this first judgment account against the men of Sodom, the young men included. And he said to God, "Will not the judge of all the earth do what's right?" See, God alone is the one who has the right to perfectly judge anyone. Only God can judge in the ultimate final sense. And so when we come to stories like this, should they disturb us? Yeah, for sure. But let's make sure they disturb us in the right way. Let's not be disturbed by something the Bible's not saying. And the Bible's not saying that God sent bears to maul little boys who laughed at an old man's bald head. The Bible's saying that the wicked people of the idolatrous center of the northern kingdom that was on its way teetering on the brink of destruction, being sent prophet after prophet to warn them to turn back to the worship of the one true God instead of the false gods who demanded all types of sexual immorality, human sacrifice, and idolatry. They encountered a prophet of God who had just been publicly and visibly proclaimed as the successor to the prophet in all of Israel, Elijah, and their response is scorn and derision. And so they experience a premature judgment very similar to the judgment that the rest of the nation is about to experience not long after this. That's what's happening in the Elisha and the bears story. It's not about being bald. If you're a bald youth pastor and the kids make fun of you, I know you like to trot this story out and scare them back in line. But that's not what this story is about, and we need to know that. If you're looking to critique the Bible for being barbaric and God being capricious and arbitrary and intolerant, fine. Attack it all you want, but just make sure that you're not attacking a straw man. Make sure you're attacking the actual text of Scripture and engage with it in a way that its own authors would accept, who wrote this story and included it in there. One of my favorite Old Testament scholars, Christopher Wright, talks about this passage and others like it in his book, Old Testament Ethics for the People of God. This is actually going to be the next Disciple Dojo book giveaway. We just gave away a copy of the Filament Study Bible. This is going to be the next one that we do a giveaway for, so pay attention if you're watching this video and subscribe, follow along, because in our next video, we'll show you how you can enter to win this. But in Old Testament Ethics for the People of God, Christopher Wright notes some of the scholars like David Pachansky who point to this story and others like it, and they reveal God as insecure, irrational, vindictive, dangerous, malevolent, and abusive. And then Wright goes on to say, there's certainly a desperate seriousness about these biblical stories and others like them. But part of the problem lies precisely in Pachansky's chosen method, which is to ask his readers, as we are told he asks his students, if all you knew about God you knew from this passage, how would you describe the divine being? But of course, this is precisely not all we know about God. There's a hugely wider canvas in the biblical canon within which these strange stories have found their place, to be heard and wrestled with in the light of everything else we know. None is easy to handle. But to isolate them and then attempt to describe the character of God exclusively on the basis of these narratives seems a very odd approach to the Scriptures. It is an odd approach. It's a disingenuous approach. It's like pointing to the use of the N-word in Huckleberry Finn as evidence that Mark Twain was a raging racist. When in fact, if you read Huck Finn, Mark Twain is actually undermining the entire concept of slavery throughout the book. But if you just grab a passage, a conversation between Huck and Jim on the raft, you're going to come away thinking this guy belongs in the Klan. So we have to read whether it's modern literature like Mark Twain or whether it's ancient literature like the book of 2 Kings. We have to read the text in its full context. We have to see the overall message, what the author is trying to communicate, and what the meta-narrative that book finds its place in is teaching about God himself. And when we do that, it doesn't clear up, it doesn't make all the Bible stories nice and happy. It doesn't turn them all into children's stories, but it's not supposed to. What it does do is it gives us a fuller picture of this God, including these acts of judgment that when we just read them in isolation, they seem really shocking. There's a reason for them. When we look at this passage in its context, it's pretty fascinating. And when we see all the connections that are being made within it and what it was intended to speak to Israel, then we can get a better idea of what it's intending to say to us today. But first, we have to get the story itself correct. And that begins with noting these translation ambiguities. But that's all for today. Thanks for watching and stay tuned.